Good evening. Professor Emeritus Shepard Krech is well known to this audience. He was active on the faculty of Brown University from 1988 until his retirement in 2010. You all know him well in his roles of Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Haffenreffer Museum. Since leaving us, he's divided his time between Maine and Washington, D.C., where he holds the position of Research Associate at the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian Institution. In fact, I assume many of you were here for his last talk in 2009 when I also introduced him. So picking up from that. But in that last talk, he shared with us his research for the beautiful book called Spirits of the Air, Birds and American Indians in the South. If you've not yet read that book, I recommend it to you highly. It presents a detailed account of understandings of birds, and it has rich illustrations of the expressions of those understandings in material culture. You'll be pleased to linger on the images of feathers and decorations and of bird figures that are molded into bowls, pipes, and pots. Since speaking to us then, Professor Krech has continued his work on ethno-ornithology. I'm the proud owner of a recent publication co-edited by him and David Gordon of Bowdoin College, which is called Indigenous Knowledge and the Environment in Africa and North America. Professor Krech has co-written the introduction to this book, which gives a helpful discussion of the concept of indigenous knowledge. Now, the word indigenous has charged politics, and it becomes even more so when applied to conservation or development of resources. The introduction and the articles to this book offer good insights into the politics of indigenous, colonial, and post-colonial knowledge. The chapter by Professor Krech on indigenous ethno-ornithology in the American South is especially good on this score because it probes relations between different folk ornithologies. As you would expect from a specialist in Native American anthropology, it begins with Indian understandings. But the real achievement of this essay is to show interchange between indigenous American, European, and African thinking about birds. By looking at names as well as stories about birds, Professor Krech found parallel sensibilities in these different groups' folk ornithologies. And he also found some evidence of exchange, although he says that's really hard to prove, but he's found really suggestive evidence about the interchange of ideas about birds. This is an important point because it moves us away from static and romantic notions that indigenous people were close to the environment at the same time separate from other people. So letting you know about this recently published work about ethno-ornithology in this new volume, I'm telling you that because I'm really interested now to hear how his talk tonight builds on the thinking that ethno-ornithology is not just for indigenous people anymore. American undergraduates have a folk ornithology that can be studied like that of other folk ornithologies. How intriguing. I look forward to hearing about it. So I give you now Professor Shepard Krech and his talk, Blue Jays, Toucans, and Starlings in Undergraduate Folk Ornithology.
Thank you, Nancy, for those thoughts. Thank you all for coming out on a lovely spring day and for taking the time to be here. What I want to speak about this afternoon is what we know about birds and the source of our knowledge. I like to think of birds as standing for nature, for the environment, or for the other than human natural world. And thus, these remarks are really on the connections between ourselves as human beings and the environments in which we live. In the broadest sense, they are about the connections between nature and culture. My thoughts come from a seminar on the, let me see if I got this. Nope. There it is. On the intersection of birds and people that I taught in 2009 and 2010. Those were my two final years in the classroom at Brown. At the outset, I'd like to, there's Terry Gentis of the Haffenreffer Museum, who has brought in a number of pieces from the Cachanawa from Peru, which we have in the center of our seminar table, and we're taking them apart. Not literally, but figuratively. Terry is here in the audience. I thank him for being here. In any event, I'd like to thank my students at the outset and kind of acknowledge them. They faithfully attended a very early morning seminar for Brown University, and they engaged in lively discussion of weekly readings and of their projects that they were undertaking. And here are all their names, which you can see. What a great 2 years worth of lively discussion and terrific students dedicated to them all. The seminar ranged globally. After an introduction to how birds have been made sense of in the Western world, we turned immediately to focus on indigenous people and on folk knowledge rather than scientific knowledge. So I begin here with a few remarks on indigenous people and on their knowledge that they possess about birds, which it becomes very important as a comparative backdrop for really the heart of my remarks. Despite the perils of generalization, if we were to ask native or indigenous people living in tropical or subtropical parts of the world, tropical or temperate zones, where biodiversity is robust or relatively so, what they knew about birds, their response would invite the following conclusion. Knowledge of birds, indeed knowledge of the environment, is extensive, if not formidable in certain well-known examples. It's based in experiential learning. Indigenous people who live in places like the Amazon or Papua New Guinea, as here, Kayapo and Dani, Kayapo on the right, Dani on the left, often recognize well over 100 different kinds of birds about them that they arrange and differentiate in quite shallow classifications. For example, the foray of New Guinea, according to Jared Diamond, who conducted very early ornithological work on them. It's little known. He's mostly known for Guns, Germs, and Steel, and a flawed book, Collapse. Guns, Germs, and Steel was a great work. But his ornithological work is hardly known at all, but it's contained in technical reports that make really interesting reading. In any event, Diamond said that these people are not only able to distinguish over 110 species of birds about them, and probably many more, but from the behavior of birds and the silhouettes can tell apart very confusing high canopy forest birds from their silhouettes, their behavior, and their voices and other criteria. Now, these are high canopy forest warblers that still confound Western ornithologists. Peruvian tropical forest Jivaroan people south of the Kayapo know even more. They name from 250 to 300 different kinds of birds in their environment out of roughly 500 that move through their territory. So they're capturing maybe 50% of the biodiversity of the avian world. This knowledge is reflected in language, in the labels that people use for elements of the natural world. The kinds of birds referred to and named by these native people tend to correspond to the species or the genus of Western biological science. Among the latter, the genera, that is, they especially correspond to those that contain one species alone, genera that are known as monotypic genera. Some argue that the genus reflects the most fundamental perceptual discontinuities in nature. And some list literally hundreds of folk generics from one society to the next. For example, one Mayan botanical collaborator distinguished nearly 500 ethnobotanical generics in Chiapas, in Mexico. The Philippine Hanuno are even more amazing. They distinguish over 900 folk generic plant types and 1,700 specific or species-specific plant types in their environment. 900 genera and 1,700 species of plants they know. They're near the upper limit, surely, of what is possible, and certainly near the upper limit of what's been observed among folk with little or no knowledge of Western scientific taxonomy. Bird names encoding the natural world are often onomatopoeic for indigenous people. And not surprisingly, birds resonate as inhabitants of both natural and cultural worlds. That is, it's entirely possible for some birds simultaneously to provide what we might call ecosystem services, eating and digesting and defecating the seeds of fruits, for example, and to figure in contexts related to myth, narrative, gender, social relations, and so on. North American Indians present a similar picture. For example, in their homeland in the American South, the Cherokee distinguished at least 110 different kinds of Jisqua bird, including several mythical ones in that 110. Many of the names, like people elsewhere, are either onomatopoeic or descriptive. For example, the northern bobwhite, quail, we would call it, is gugwe. You will know that as a two-note call of the bobwhite, of the quail. The whippoorwill, waguli. Whippoorwill, waguli, three-syllable, again, onomatopoeic. Carolina chickadee is even more interesting. It's chickadee, chickadee. You compare our chickadee to that, and you might wonder about a connection. There is indeed one. Chickadee, or tsikilili is the word that jumped from some Iroquoian language like Cherokee or perhaps Oneida into English. These are typical onomatopoeic names among the Cherokee. The descriptive names include a word that translates as searching nose for the American woodcock, which drills in the ground for grubs. A worm-eating warbler, which has stripes on its head, is called kiyuki, which in Cherokee translates very simply chipmunk, which has stripes on its back. Worm-eating warbler is a tiny little bird, but stripes on its head are just like stripes on a chipmunk's back. White breasted nuthatch, there it is called something that translates climbing up and down on a round thing. And the northern mockingbird, right here, attacking a snake somewhere, are called by a word that means it's sukudigiski. It means head eating, and what it refers to is the belief that if you eat a head of the mockingbird, it will make you intelligent. Other native people, interestingly enough, called this bird, the mockingbird, by names that evoke the linguist or the polyglot, which makes sense. If you've ever heard of a mockingbird, it mimics every single bird in a series in its environment. Cherokee taxonomy of birds is shallow. Rarely more than 2 named levels below the bird. But the species, or the monotypic genus, the generic species, if you will, is a significant unit for them. Many Cherokee names for birds correspond to the species or to the generic species. The word for killdeer, for wild turkey, for barred owl, for screech owl, for yellow-billed cuckoo, for belted kingfisher. One could go on and on. All of these are species-specific labels for these birds. In their taxonomy and their recognition of the species, they seem typical of indigenous people, who often carve up nature into the same basic, meaningful units as in Western science. Yet they're not consistent, and it's in the inconsistencies that you begin to see culture emerging in fascinating ways. For example, they reserve their most elaborate distinctions for birds that we would call raptors, for things like red-tailed hawks, red-shouldered hawks, broad-winged hawks, and marsh hawks, and the kestrel and the peregrine. All these birds receive species-specific names, individual names, yet all are grouped together in an intermediate level between Jisqua bird and the individual species. This is rare, or comparatively so, meaning something like hawk, this intermediate level tawodi, embraces birds that ornithologists might also be tempted to group together in similar fashion, in similar affinity. The Cherokee also lumps certain birds under the same label. The turkey vulture and black vultures, which look alike, are called just by one label. The scarlet tanager and the summer tanager kind of look alike. Same structure, even if different colors. They are one bird. The orchard oriole and the Baltimore oriole, same thing for them. And the downy and the hairy woodpecker also receive this treatment. And the Cherokee go further with their lumping. Calling many shorebirds, there are at least 9 species that go through Cherokee territory. Something that translates, they put their legs in water. And many sparrows that wintered in Cherokee territory in phenomenal numbers, the Cherokee called the principal bird. These are classical little brown jobs. So this lumping marks a departure from the one label per species. At sometimes, the Cherokee and their neighbors split birds in really interesting ways that would not be split in Western science. And one of the best examples comes from the Chickasaw, who, in whose territory one could find both bald eagles and golden eagles. And instead of having 2 different birds, the bald eagle and the golden eagle, the Chickasaw thought of them as 4 different birds: adult bald eagle, immature bald eagle, adult golden eagle, and immature golden eagle. They called them their own thing. The 4 types were, in translation, white-headed, red-headed, big, and striped. Why were there 4? Well, eagles were extremely important in polity, in representations of polity, and in affirmations of political events. And for a people for whom eagles were so important politically, and for whom eagle feathers were charged in sacred ceremony and in secular contexts, and who desired the tail feathers of immature golden eagles over the tail feathers of mature golden eagles, they're white with black tips and extremely important. Then splitting these birds, these 2 species, into 4 species should perhaps not come as a surprise. So the general impression one gets is about, I'm not going to say much more about indigenous people here, in these and other cases, is a vast curiosity about the natural world, great experience in the natural world, and great knowledge of the avian world. If for birds we substituted insects, say, or plants, or mammals, or any other domain, I think we would arrive at a similar conclusion. Now, back to, again, one seminar with thanks to Kathy Lutz for the pictures, Terry again expounding on Kashinawa headdresses. The students completed various assignments in the seminar. For independent research, time, geography, and budget made it impossible for us to work with indigenous people in order to plumb their knowledge of birds, which would have been ideal, I suppose, but impossible. So instead we called on the most convenient folk at hand, brown undergraduates known to the students in the seminar, and asked them what they knew about birds and about the sources of their knowledge, letting them stand in for folk elsewhere. The projects were really quite straightforward. I asked each student to select 4 undergraduates not enrolled in seminar and have each first list freely all the birds they knew, leaving open what constitutes a bird and what to call each bird. Secondly, to provide, where possible, associations for each bird on the list, like free association. And third, to sort some 70 small cards, on each of which was the image of a bird and a number, into as many different piles as there were different kinds of birds. To name each pile if possible, then to combine the piles on the basis of shared attributes, however construed, to name the new pile, and to continue piling and naming until unable or unwilling to go any further. I caution the students not to coach the respondents, not to lead them into answers, not to tell them what was or was not a bird, for example, not to substitute species for kind of bird, how many kinds of birds do you know, and so on. I advise them, in short, that there were no correct answers in this exercise, and there were no incorrect answers either. They were just culturally revealing answers, I was hoping, and hoping to elicit information that ranged widely in its assumptions from Western biological science to various systems of folk knowledge. That was the hope. The project was intended to reveal bird knowledge and taxonomy, a folk ornithology, if you will, where the folk consists of a sample of Brown undergraduates. Despite a small sample, and a non-random sample at that, and impressionistic and anecdotal results, I was hoping that synthesis, however tentative it might be, was worthwhile here. So I'm going to offer some thoughts on the results elicited from 60 students in 2009-2010. The student respondents were from all classes, undergraduate classes. Their concentrations, if they were decided at the time, ranged from classics and literature to political science, economics, biology, and engineering. That is, from the humanities to the sciences. They were almost equally male and female. Nearly all lived in urban, suburban, or rural parts of the United States. Most were from east of the Mississippi, interestingly, and many from the Northeast, too, a real heavy cluster. Several had lived abroad at one time or another. In ethnicity, most self-identified as European American, of European American descent. There were exceptions, including students whose ancestry included Hispanics, Native Americans, or Chinese ethnicity. So the first task, as mentioned, was to list freely all the birds known. Again, no directions on what constitutes a bird. Do we have a handout? Do you all have a table? We really need one, if possible. Yeah, one side of that. Well, we can keep going. It will come quickly. It's in another room, I guess. So the first task was to list freely all birds known, with no particular directions. The responses are here. They range from 9 to 118 names of birds. Nearly 1/3 of the students list from 20 to 29 birds. The average numbers, skewed upward by several high listers, are in the 30s, and the median, half above and half below, is in the low 30s, 31.5 for those of you who want to know, and the mean is 38. I don't put great stock in these numbers, so I don't like any of my numbers either, so I'm just going to try to say 1/4 or 1/2 of whatever. One shouldn't get too misled into thinking that this is a completely exact science here. Collectively, the 60 respondents named a total of approximately 400 birds. Not surprisingly, the longest lists were provided by students who had learned about birds from family members or who had spent time in the outdoors on their own or with others. For example, one student who named 118 kind of birds, it's a high lister, is the daughter of an ornithologist. Another, who was an experienced birder and interested in ecological conservation, named 89 different kinds of birds. A third, with 85 birds, is a granddaughter of an ornithologist and worked in an experimental forestry program. And a fourth, who, like the third, also has an ornithologist for a grandfather, was taken on bird walks by her mother. In these top listers, we can see the influence of familial and other social and avocational connotations, as well as, presumably, of the outdoors, a knowledge of place. As is evident in Table 1, and from the median of the low 30s, however, these high listers were in the minority. In a sample, 1/2 of whose members could not or did not list freely more than 31 birds known. I think that's the message to take away here. One question about these numbers is, are the totals or averages above or below what might be expected? What is the highest reasonable or possible number of birds that any person might list? If knowledge of birds comes from the natural world, we need to establish that, and haven't done it yet. And if names are species or generic species names, such as the names given by indigenous people, the answer, at least for North America, is suggested by 3 readily available sources. The annual Christmas bird counts held each December, the annual Great Backyard Bird Count each February, and state checklists of birds. For instance, let me just mention a couple of examples here. In December 2009, 60,000 observers counted 55 million birds in the United States and Canada, and over 650 species in the United States alone, as that part of the Christmas bird counts. That's a lot of birds. The state checklists give an additional indication of the birds around during different parts of the year. Most states, and all we need to know here, is that most states list from 400 to 600 species within their borders. California leads the pack with 644 species, and Texas with 646. Here they are. Had the list. Rhode Island lists only 418 birds in its state checklist, which is on the low end. But 400 to 600 is the range for most. Measured against these data, especially the 400 to 600 range, the 31 birds listed by the average respondent seems fairly puny. It represents just 9% of the Rhode Island total, for example. Granted, the 118 birds listed by the top lister is over 1/4 of this total for Rhode Island, but the list provided by this respondent included birds not found in Rhode Island or indeed in North America. This adds a wrinkle. For some, knowledge of birds comes from sources other than the natural world in any particular state or region of North America. Later, we'll take up the implications of this. At this point, however, we might conclude tentatively that knowledge of the avian world possessed by this sample of undergraduates is slight. Now let's turn to the birds listed by name. Students were asked to name all the birds they knew, but, as mentioned, were provided no further direction. What are the names, and what do they reveal of taxonomy? The first question, the names, is an easy one to answer. The 60 respondents, as I said, named a grand total of 400 birds. 70 of these, the top 70 birds, and I ask you to look now at the handout that's going around. 70 birds named by 10 or more respondents. 70 of these were listed by 10 or more. These hold the most interest, and I'll refer often to the top 70 birds in the rest of my remarks. But remember that the average number of birds free-listed was only in the low 30s, 31. Of the top 70, only 22 birds were named by 1/2 of the respondents. You can see this quickly. And only 5, blue jay, sparrow, ostrich, robin, cardinal, by 2/3 or more of the respondents. Most often named was the blue jay, mentioned by 53 of the 60 respondents. And there you have before you the table. Again, we can turn to the comparative question. How does this list of the top 70 compare to the birds seen most often or that are most numerous in any given region? The great backyard bird count, that 4-day snapshot of birds, provides an answer that I'd like to explore here. The cumulative numbers in the great backyard bird count, like the annual Christmas counts, are also very impressive. In this past February, just a couple of months ago, over 100,000 people in the United States and Canada reported over 600 species and more than 17 million birds in their backyards. The year before, 2011, here's one bird often counted, as you'll see. In 2011, the 10 most frequently reported birds in the Great Backyard Bird Count, GBBC, were, as you can see, and these are all species names: northern cardinal, mourning dove, dark-eyed junco, downy woodpecker, American goldfinch, blue jay, American crow, black-capped chickadee, house finch, tufted titmouse. These are all species names in Western science. It's interesting that of these, only 3, the blue jay, the cardinal, I'm allowing license here, and the mourning dove, appear in the top 70 list. Only 3 of these 10. Because of the uncertainty of identification, 3 other top 70 birds in the top 70 list, called goldfinch, crow, and finch, are problematic matches for the great backyard bird count species. 4 GBBC birds are completely absent from the top 70: the junco, the woodpecker, the black-capped chickadee, and the tufted titmouse. They don't appear. Now, let's turn to another result from the Great Backyard Bird Count. The earlier one was the most frequently reported, most frequent stations. Now are the most numerous birds. The most numerous birds in the Great Backyard Bird Count were, number 1, the European starling. Look at the numbers, 1.3 million. American robin, common grackle, Canada goose, red-winged blackbird, snow goose, American crow, American goldfinch, gargoyle, junco, and mallard, which is at the tail end of the list with 250,000, the bottom of the top 10. In some cases, these numbers again were quite impressive. Two of these, the robin and Canada goose, again I'm allowing the robin to be the American robin. Wouldn't work on the border between Texas and Mexico, but there it goes. Two appear, or surely do, in the case of robin, in the top 70. Three others, crow, blackbird, goldfinch, are again uncertain because of identification. I'll say more about this. 5 birds are absent from the top 70: the starling, the common grackle, the snow goose, the dark-eyed junco, and the mallard. Please note this one here, the starling. We'll come back to it at the end. So the conclusion is that the top 70 birds listed by the respondents include with certainty only 1/4, only 25%, of the top 10 commonest winter birds measured by both frequency and by numbers in the 2011 GVBC. And you would get that same conclusion no matter what recent year you looked at for the Great Backyard Bird Count. There's a disjunct, if you will, between this list that's provided by the students and the birds that are out there in their natural environments in the Great Backyard Bird Count. The second question, so this part was easy, the names. The second question, what do the names reveal of taxonomy or classification, is really thornier. Like the length of the bird list and the median number free-listed, bird names reveal knowledge of a sort. Names reveal place and rank in the ordering of the natural world. Recall what was mentioned at the outset about indigenous people and about the primacy of the species or the monotypic genus. Keep that in mind as I go forward. For those trained in Western biological science, bird names reveal place in a system of classification. Today, this presents a bit of a problem because recent work on genetics has unsettled the consensus that once existed on how to represent taxonomic place. Although the classification of birds has never been static, and it's a really interesting exercise going back into the 16th and 17th century classifications of birds that were first emerging as ornithology emerged as a discipline, it's never been static. Taxonomy today is in particular flux because of laboratory research on mitochondrial genomes and DNA hybridization. The results are sometimes surprising. So radical are some taxonomic implications of genetic research on traditional assessments of relationships among birds based on morphology, voice, behavior, habitat, geographical isolation, and the like. Old world warblers, for example, little birds that you see throughout the old world, in the words of one participant, look like they've been run through a blender by DNA sequencing. They just come out with different connections to other birds and ones that were not suspected from those very traditional observations of behavior and knowledge of their habitats and their voice and so on. There's a huge break between people who get their taxonomy from close field observation and from those who are in the lab. And the two are not exactly on the same plane. Anyway, so run through a blender. Now, this work is not above suspicion. It's not without its critics, who argue that it is as subjective in what it chooses to measure, its choice of what to measure and to compare, as earlier taxonomic work is. So you're dealing just with different levels of subjectivity. The sense I get, and that many have, is that this argument is not going to be settled once and for all anytime soon, especially in the classification of 90% of the birds, which are in a group called passerines, which are recently evolved and still kind of stretching their boundaries of where they belong. There it's completely, well, it's quite murky. So because of this unsettled nature of the argument, I employ here the still useful, and still widely used now traditional taxonomy of the biological class known as aves, birds, which consists of 40 biological orders of birds, 233 families of birds within those. Within those families, 2,232 genera that contain as many as an estimated 10,400 species of birds worldwide. These four ranked categories, the order, the family, the genus, and the species, are the basic ones in what can be considered today as the traditional taxonomy of birds. These categories often are not sufficient for finer discrimination, for which reason intermediate categories, often with the prefix supra, infra, sub, super, are employed to handle the intermediate cases. The taxonomy is clearly multi-leveled and ranked, as one can see, and there's a total of anywhere from 6 to 10 ranked levels of specificity or generality, depending on whether you're moving down toward the species and subspecies or upward toward aves. The species is the most widely known category in this rank. It's practically sacrosanct in some circles. I mean, just think of the Endangered Species Act. So what taxonomic levels are referenced in the top 70 bird names, which you have in front of you, provided by the respondents? We'd especially like to know how specific or how general their bird names are, how their names compare in taxonomic reference to the names given to birds by indigenous people or in Western biological science, which there tending to be a convergence between the two, as I've already mentioned. The question of taxonomic levels referenced in the names would be easier to answer if we could determine the boundaries of the local or even the regional area for the birds listed, the places where the birds are known. As readily can be seen, however, from your lists, which you have in your hands, the top 70 birds come from around the world, and they include at least one extinct species, the dodo. If the world is construed as the local area, you're going to get one answer, one answer on taxonomic reference. It's a global answer. If it is seen more narrowly as North America, the continent, you'll get a second answer. And if it is the Northeast, the latter two represent home, if you will, for most respondents, then we will come to other taxonomic conclusions about the names of the birds that are listed in the top 70. The differences are summarized in this table before you, which compares taxonomic reference in those three geographical areas. The cells in this table contain numbers of top 70 birds with specific taxonomic reference for the three geographical regions. Thus, regardless of where they're found, 18 birds are species globally. The blue jay, that's a species-specific label. Ostrich, it is also, works. Chicken, if you will, Gallus domesticus. Bald eagle, emu, fine. Peregrine falcon, absolutely species. Red-tailed hawk, yes. Canada goose, yup. Dodo, Blue-footed booby, yes. Snowy owl, a species. Golden eagle, a species. Great blue heron, yes. Cockatiel, even it. Great horned owl, turkey vulture, and mourning dove. They're all species, no matter where, globally, in North America, or in the Northeast, where, of course, some don't appear, and poor old dodo's gone forever. In North America, the number of species increases in that column, if you see, because some birds considered as genera or subfamilies globally are species in North America. Examples of this are the flamingo, a turkey, stork, and macaw. They're representative. They reference higher order taxa globally than they do in North America, because in North America it doesn't contain all of the genera. The number of species climbs further in the Northeast for similar regions. For example, kingfisher, a subfamily globally, is reduced to a species in the Northeast. Another example is bluebird. I've taken a little bit of license here. Western bluebird on the left, eastern on the right, and mountain in the center. It's a genus of, bluebird is a genus of 3 species in North America, but it's represented only by a single species in the Northeast, the eastern bluebird on the right-hand side of the slide. So I've taken the liberty of considering it as a species because there's only one by name in the region. You're not going to see the other 2, except perhaps exceedingly rarely, despite the existence of them in far greater numbers in Western North America. The same process converts the mockingbird, the quail, northern bobwhite, known as quail, the parakeet, the only example is the monk parakeet in the Northeast, and several other birds as species. It converts them into species in the Northeast versus their taxonomic ranks in North America or in the world. In contrast to these species names, are names that lack specificity in many, if not all, contexts. For example, look at egret. Egret in North America is a subfamily of 3 genera and 5 species. So if you see an egret, you might ask, well, which of 5 species of egrets might it be? Owl is a global suborder of even higher order. Contains 2 family, 11 genera, and 19 species. In the Northeast, owl is still 2 families containing 8 genera and 10 species. A bird is an owl, but that covers a lot of ground on which owl it might be. Finch is another global suborder that in North America is represented by 17 species. Parakeet is a global subfamily that includes 81 species. In North America, seagull, for which we'll substitute gull. Seagull is a good vernacular term for the bird, connecting these birds with the sea, even if members that are seagulls live far from the sea and never come close to it. Seagull is a subfamily of 25 genera and 27 species, and swallow refers to a subfamily of 8 species and 5 genera, any of which might be encountered. Woodpecker is similar, and as are other birds. As with these birds, so with duck, sparrow, and crow, in all 3 areas, global, North America, and the Northeast, duck, which is the number 7 bird on the top 70 list, refers to an avian subfamily. In North America, it contains 39 species. Sparrow, the classic little brown job, and the number 2 bird in the top 70, is a global suborder and a family of 49 species. Crow refers globally to more than 30 species as part of a genus. American crow, fish crow, hooded crow, carrion crow, New Caledonian crow, house crow, Slenderbill crow, little crow. The list goes on, all in the genus Corvus, all different kinds of crows. So despite the speculative nature of these comments, my reluctance to let the figures bear too much weight, we can see that in taxonomic terms, some names are indeed specific. The most specific are the species names, and other names, in contrast, are general, even very general indeed. They refer to biological orders or suborders which are near the top of the taxonomic scale. Slightly over 1/2 of the Northeast birds reference species, compared to slightly over 1/4 of the global birds, with North America in between. Conversely, over 1/2 of the global names are subfamily, family, or suborder names, compared to slightly over 1/4 of the Northeast names, again with North America somewhere in between. These figures stand in marked contrast to the overwhelming tendency for species-specific or monotypic genus-specific reference of indigenous names for birds in the environments in which they live. In a nutshell, the names that students use for birds tend to lack specificity. It's more than passing interest that the names that refer to species, no matter where they occur, blue jay, ostrich, bald eagle, emu, peregrine falcon, red-tailed hawk, Canada goose, dodo, blue-billed booby, snowy owl, and so forth. These birds tend overwhelmingly, in 14 of the 17 cases of these names, to be raptors or large birds. This is surely not a coincidence. And in many societies, large birds or carnivorous birds signify and stand out far more than small birds that are insectivores or whose diets are based on other foodstuffs. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that one part of the exercise was the pile and sort project with 77 cards. Here's just some thrown down and on the screen for you. You can see each little card has a bird on it, and each little card has a number on it, but there's no name of any bird. This is an interesting exercise, but I find the results kind of idiosyncratic and quirky and kind of interesting for those two reasons, but they're not easily summarized. Let me give you a couple of examples here. One student sorted and distinguished piles labeled aquatic birds, colorful birds, birds with long beaks, birds with long legs, little fluffy birds, little not so fluffy birds, blackbirds, predatory birds, edible birds, and birds that many people don't like. The categories held birds that bore little taxonomic relationship to each other and then exhibited unexpected qualities. In this example, one of the predatory birds, for example, was the black guillemot, which is a diminutive saltwater species that preys, on sea worms, little red ones, which it carries around in its beak. But it's not exactly your example of a kind of a major top-ranked predatory raptor. One, also in this same scheme, one bird that many people don't like was the pileated woodpecker, and I'm not quite sure why that is. Called logcock and other things by Cherokee and other Indians. I'm now thinking of this bird, the pileated. They denigrated the pileated for really interesting reasons, whereas the ivory-billed woodpecker, the other major woodpecker in the South, was enormously valued and found in graves all along in the South and up into the upper Missouri River. So a real difference between those two birds. But I have no idea why this was a bird that many people don't like. Little not-so-fluffy birds included a thrush, a rail, a nuthatch, a vireo, a junco, and a warbler, all quite different from each other and with no relationship to each other. Another student produced a sorting of categories labeled small and harmless, ludicrously long beaks, particularly showy, appear aquatic, and everyday birds. And a third labeled the piles, favorite birds, badass birds, water birdies, fatzos, and lovable leftovers. I really wasn't quite sure what to do with all this. The criteria each person used for sorting the birds and piling varied greatly and unpredictably. Sorting decisions were based variously on color, shape, edibility, diet, bill length and shape, bill length and bill shape, size, large, small, roundness, habitat, beach, marsh, water, land, etc., and other characteristics not easily explained. Water, however, was an important habitat for many. One person labeled the categories, a couple of categories, duck and owl, and the categories actually contained ducks alone and owls alone among the 77 cards. But this struck me as an exception. Taxonomies were much more like the ones I've described, and they were no more than 3 or at the most 4 levels deep, presuming bird at the top. Perhaps the most important assumption underlying Table 3 with the global North America and Northeast is that knowledge of birds in one of these areas is rooted in place, a natural place or an environment where birds live and where birds are known. Granted, the respondents, as mentioned, are overwhelmingly American students who have spent most of their lives in the United States, and many are from the East. But it's risky to assume, I think, that because of this, their knowledge of birds, including bird names, derives only or mostly from nature, or that it is rooted in a fairly specific place. I think we need to establish that rather than assume it. So the part of the research project designed to shed light on associations with each bird addresses this question, more so than any other aspect of this research. Some top 70 birds were indeed associated with their habitats, with their habits or behavior, with their histories, or with habitats in which they're found. The clearest examples of these are the vultures and the turkey vulture, the dodo, the finch, the pigeon, and seagull. The vultures and turkey vultures, they're two separate names in the list, could be combined, perhaps, but it's risky to do so, are connected persistently and correctly with eating dead things, with roadkill, and with scavenging. All these things are mentioned by more than just a handful of students. One student, however, came out of left field, or did that student, in being reminded of Peanuts, in which Snoopy acts the vulture. There's as good a representation of that as you can have. The dodo presents a similar picture. Nearly all students who listed the dodo associated it correctly with extinction. Gone from Mauritius by 1681 as a result of Dutch colonial enterprise, it gave birth to the expression dead as a dodo, and from then on stood for extinction. Interestingly, for those who might be familiar with the tale, no one picked up on Lewis Henry Carroll's dodo bird. In Alice's Adventures, he invested it with the simple wisdom to figure out that all one had to do to dry off after being immersed in Alice's sea of tears was to run in a circle for a while. So much for the other common expression connected with the dodo, dumb as a dodo. This Lewis Henry Carroll's dodo strikes me as quite smart here. John Tenniel's engravings, however, live on. Whoops, sorry. Right there. Alice and Dodo on the t-shirt. The finch also presents an interesting tale. Most who offered associations with the finch did not mention the purple finch or the house finch on the left, or the habitat in which the finches are found or their place, but instead they connected it squarely with Darwin, with Darwin's finches and the Galapagos. Several students had read a book which all incoming freshmen read a couple of years ago, Beak of the Finch, that important work that explores natural selection and evolution today among Darwin's finches. And I know several of the students had read that book in some of their upper division classes. The pigeon presents another interesting example. The sixth most named bird. It was commonly associated by all students with the city. New York was mentioned by quite a few people. And it was associated with other urban settings like Trafalgar Square. It's clear that respondents did not like pigeons. They called them dirty, among other things, several times, and one called them a flying rat. There it is, Photoshop. Or not. 3 feet, tail. Lastly, seagull is connected consistently with the beach, the shore, the ocean, with dropping clams to open them, with stealing one food, all mirrored in actual behavior of clever and opportunistic gulls. In contrast to these associations that place birds in reasonable environmental, historical, or behavioral contexts, are others that explore connections similar to the ones between the vulture and Snoopy, despite Snoopy's, or should we say Charles Schutz's, accurate vulturine posture. For example, the blue jay, the most often listed bird by 53 of 60 people, was connected not with habitat or behavior or voice, its familiar autumn voice, but instead with a baseball team, the Toronto Blue Jays. Ditto for the cardinal. Number 5 on the top 70 list. Nothing about diet, habitat, range, behavior, or sharp calls, only about the football cardinals in Phoenix and the baseball cardinals in St. Louis. Not even anything about the cardinals who actually gave the bird its name by their own colors. They were not mentioned. Many of the birds listed in the top 70 were treated in similar fashion. Flamingos were associated with lawn ornaments. Ugly lawn art, one person commented. The pelican with Finding Nemo. The woodpecker, these are all the names in the top 70, with Woody Woodpecker. The red-tailed hawk with the popular series Animorphs. The mockingbird with Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. The duck with Robert McCloskey's make way for ducklings. That book about ducklings in Boston, one person said. Raven, with Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Swan, with E.B. White's Trumpet of the Swan, and with Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. The Bald Eagle, with the Colbert Report. And the Toucan, with Toucan Sam and Fruit Loops, the breakfast cereal. One could go on. It's not just that students associated birds with popular culture, but that they omitted any mention of birds in their natural surroundings. Yet one conclusion, at least from these associations, is that there is an extensive, dense, and rich fund of context for birds in popular culture, one that is clearly a source of inspiration for associations with birds among undergraduates, at least as sample, at Brown, and by hypothesis perhaps among American college students with exposure similar to Brown's students. It might be tempting to rest the case with this thought, and I'm going to close now, but before closing, I must address why certain fairly common birds remain invisible in the top 70. Some are small and migrant and remain in forest canopy or are otherwise inconspicuous. Warblers, vireos, flycatchers, and others like them come immediately to mind. They're conspicuous in their absence. But not all are like this. The one that surprised me most, I must confess, in its omission from the top 70 is the European starling. It was mentioned by only 9 of the 60 respondents, and its lowly position is noteworthy. Introduced in North America in the 1890s, technically an exotic and invasive species, this bird is immensely adaptable. It bred successfully, and it spread rapidly across the continent. Today, it is found nearly everywhere. Its numbers have long been high. You remember, in the great backyard bird counts, it checked in, consistently between 2009 and 2012 in the top 6 most numerous birds, with over 500,000 individuals nationally. And in 2011, we have seen that it was number 1 with over 1.3 million birds tallied. Why is the starling so poorly visible? I really can't answer this question, except by suggesting that it is so common that it's not seen, or it's so dirty a city bird that it does not count. Of course, it's not just a city bird. You can see, although this murmuration, as it's called, up top, spectacular sightings, really quite remarkable. And this over cornfield. Winter congregations and our aggregations are really quite amazing as well. And other birds do this as well. There's a roost of, 2 winters ago, there was a roost of 1 million robins just 4 miles west of Tampa. So it might be so common that it's not seen, or so dirty a city bird that it doesn't kind of count as a bird. Speculation. Or maybe a richer set of associations to explore. Perhaps it doesn't figure in popular culture nearly to the extent that these other birds do, and therefore it escapes notice in the very sources that bring meaning to birds in the collective imagination of the sample of student respondents. Of course, there is Agent Starling in the infamously gustatory Silence of the Lambs, but I really don't know where to go with this. I can't leave off without following up on the implications of the use of such a rich source of bird knowledge, those associations in popular culture. Compared to the indigenous people with whom we began, these undergraduates show what might be regarded as an impoverished knowledge of birds and their place in their natural environments. They know and list relatively few birds. They often miss the most frequently reported and the most numerous birds recorded in those bird counts. Their names for birds lack specificity. Their taxonomic sortings are idiosyncratic and unpredictable and bear little, if any, relationship to classification rooted in understandings of birds in their natural settings. As bleak as some might consider these words, we should be aware that several other studies exist on knowledge of nature, knowledge of trees, birds, mammals, and so forth, among undergraduates in American universities. And the conclusions do not differ greatly from these. Authors use similar language about depauperate knowledge and perhaps devolved contemporary knowledge of the natural world. The reduced experience in the natural world, the reduced knowledge of the natural world, the reduced contact with nature, Gary Nabhan calls this an extinction of experience does not bode well as we enter the next great extinction event in the history of the planet. How can or will we know how to react to the changes affecting our world when we possess neither names for the fundamental units in that world and the fundamental units affected, the species of the monotypic genera, nor do we possess understandings of them that can be traced beyond popular culture to the habitats or the ecological niches that they inhabit and that are changing so rapidly. Thank you very much.